it's an honor to be here today speaking to you all 75 years after the death of Virginia Woolf. The title of the talk, which has kind of gone between Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and Who's Afraid of Great Aunt Virginia and Who's Afraid of Aunty Virginia. Anyway, the title, of course, is a pun on the play from 1962 by Edward Albee called Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I should add, Virginia is not my aunt, she's not my mother, she's actually my great aunt, so she's my dad's aunt. In Lahore, I was asked whether she was my mother, and I worked out that that would make me 71 years old, minimum. So she's definitely not my mum, because she died that long ago. I sometimes wonder if we are all afraid of Virginia Woolf, and if so, why? Who is the Virginia Woolf that you know? Maybe you've read her most famous novels, To the Lighthouse, or Mrs. Dalloway, or Orlando. Maybe you've seen the films. Maybe you know her reputation, but you haven't actually read her. You just haven't got round to it. Or maybe you just know her name from that play. Growing up as a wolf, I've come to realize that there are many Virginias, many different versions. There's the young girl experiencing the death of her mother at the age of 13 years old. There's the aspiring writer drafting and redrafting her first novel and feeling like an absolute failure, which I'm sure many of us know. There's the young newlywed sending wonderfully childish, loving little notes to her husband, Leonard, with their little pet animal names. She called herself Mandrill, and he called himself Mongoose. But, whatever. There is the patient, the mental patient, who experienced repeated nervous breakdowns, hearing voices in her sickbed, and suffering from what nowadays we would call probably bipolar disorder. Then there's the observer living in the centre of London in the middle of the First World War, then experiencing the Second World War at the end of her life. There's the woman who was witty and fun and fantastic company at parties, the loving sister, the fond aunt, the gossipy literary figure at the heart of the Bloomsbury Group. There are many different sides to her, and today what I want to try and do is open up some of the other sides to Virginia Woolf that you might not know about, mostly through her own letters and her own diaries, because I think it's nice to go back to her own words, but also through some family reminiscences and some of my dad's memories of her. I'll start with a few lines from Virginia's diary. I caused a slight argument with Leonard this morning by trying to cook my breakfast in bed. I believe that the good sense of the proceeding will make it prevail, that is, if I can dispose of the eggshells. That was 100 years ago. That was her latest domestic experiment. She sounds like she was about as good a cook as I am. She was trying to cook eggs in bed, and I'm not sure why. But what's funny is that was exactly 100 years ago, and that year, 1915, was to become one of the worst years of Virginia's life. Reading her letters and diaries recently in the London Library, I discovered a much more playful side to this writer, sort of a modernist that we've come to think of as terribly stern and humorless, this suicidal woman, even tortured. In fact, Virginia's daily journal, her correspondences with friends, reveal a young woman who loved to lark around. She was always playing practical jokes on her friends. She loved to gossip and just have fun. She loved parties. She loved having people around for dinner and going to tea and all of that stuff. So it's a very different kind of Virginia Woolf that comes across. And this time in her life, the time when she was trying to cook eggs in bed, was actually a precious lull before the storm, because as I said, 1915 was to turn into one of the most severe nervous breakdowns of her life. And sadly, these breakdowns were nothing new. The sudden death of her mother from rheumatic fever in 1895 had provoked her first breakdown at the age of 13. And Virginia's description of her mother's death is absolutely heartbreaking. She recalls her mother's last words to her as she crept out of the room. Her mother said, "Hold yourself straight, my little goat." And goat, Billy Goat, because of Ginny, Virginia, Billy Goat was what they called her in the family, and so her mum's last words are beautiful. "Hold yourself straight, my little goat." Then Virginia describes being taken up to say goodbye to her mother for the last time. In fact, it was a few minutes after she died. She saw her mother's body lying on the great bed, lying on her side, not even laid out, but lying on her side in the great bed. And she kissed her face, which was still warm. Virginia had this moment of crisis. Even at the age of 13, she had this moment of crisis. She said, I remember I saw the nurse weeping and I felt absolutely nothing. So even so early in her life, she was starting to think about the difference between what we should feel and what she did actually feel. Then she was taken into the bedroom again the next morning. I don't think we would do this with children today, but she was taken into the bedroom again the next morning to bid her mother farewell for the last time. She says, her face looked immeasurably distant, hollow and stern. When I kissed her, it was like kissing cold iron. Whenever I touch cold iron, the feeling comes back to me, the feeling of my mother's face, iron cold and granulated. I mean, I think for a 13-year-old to feel that about your mother who's been dead for 24 hours is absolutely, she really captures the fear and the strangeness of death and the coldness of it all. Her father's death in 1904 triggered her second collapse, and her nephew, the biographer Quentin Bell, wrote, all that summer she was mad. So she had another very severe breakdown when her father died. She then endured the death of her half-sister in 1897 and her beloved brother Toby in 1907. So these repeated bereavements throughout her childhood and to adolescence took their toll on her mental health. Perhaps that's understandable. We know about Virginia Woolf's breakdowns, but perhaps we don't realize exactly what she was going through during that time. And then her third breakdown that I refer to in 1913, aged 31, occurred less than a year after her marriage to my great-uncle, Leonard Woolf. During the course of 1913 to 1915, she made several suicide attempts. She tried to jump out of a window, and she took very, very powerful sedatives. As the madness took hold regularly, she would stop eating, she would stop sleeping, and she would hallucinate. She once heard the birds singing in Greek, and she saw King Edward VII lurking in the flower beds. I find it funny, but it's also obviously really, really tragic. But to hear the birds singing in Greek is quite creative, really, as breakdowns go. And what's strange about this is that this era, 1915 to 1916, so 100 years ago, ought to have been a really good time for Virginia Woolf. As well as the publication of her first novel, she just got married, and she was starting to make a living from reviewing and other critical work. She and Leonard Woolf were living in Richmond. I don't know if you know London, but it's a beautiful, very expensive part of West London. It's green and it's leafy, and all my very rich friends live out in Richmond. They were making plans to set up their printing press, and they were even discussing buying a bulldog that they wanted to call John. So why did 1915 take such a disastrous turn for her? Well, partly because she'd been grappling with the endless drafting and rewriting of that first novel that I mentioned, The Voyage Out. Leonard recalled her rewriting it with a tortured intensity. Finally, it was published in March 1915, the day after Virginia entered the nursing home where she was to spend the next 6 months with her breakdown. The novel had actually been accepted for publication in 1913, but it was delayed because of all these repeated hospitalizations. Throughout Virginia's life, the process of writing a book and then finishing it and working on proofs became a time of extreme anxiety, not only the wait for publication, which lots of writers know, but also her terror over the critical response, what the reviewers were going to say. In 1936, so that's another 20 years later, while struggling with the years, she recalled the misery and self-doubt she had experienced 2 decades earlier with her first book. I never suffered since The Voyage Out such acute despair on rereading. I have never been so near the precipice to my own feeling. She describes it so well, that self-doubt, the kind of torture of writing a book. If you've read Virginia's novels already, but you want to know more about her, I really recommend the letters and the diaries, because they give that other side to her, and it sort of opens up a different perspective. And the joy of Virginia's personal writing is how varied the content is, from literary highs to domestic lows, her gossip about contemporaries and relatives, many other famous writers, often satirical and very often spiteful. She could be really, really nasty about people, really malicious. She was very malicious about the Jews, the Woolfs, my side of the family. And now people call her anti-Semitic, but obviously it was a very different time. It's 100 years ago. On one day in January 1915, I found her writing to Thomas Hardy, saying, Dear Mr. Hardy, I have long wished to tell you how profoundly grateful I am to you for your poems and novels, but naturally it seemed an impertinence to do so. And in her diary on the very same day, she was writing about their house of trouble in Richmond. The pipes burst or got choked, the roof split asunder. Anyhow, in the middle of the morning, I heard a steady rush of water. Various people have been clambering about on the roof ever since, and the water is still dripping through the ceiling. So it's lovely to see the side that's writing to Thomas Hardy, and then is also talking about the water gushing through the roof. And the diaries also offer a fascinating insight into Virginia's early development as a writer. She says, I wrote all the morning with infinite pleasure, which is queer, because I know all the time there is no reason to be pleased with what I write, and in 6 weeks, or even 6 days, I shall hate it. These sound to me like the typical ups and downs of any writer, not a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. While she was hesitating, so to go back a little to 1912, while Virginia was hesitating over Leonard's proposal of marriage, she struggled to reconcile her feelings. Emotionally, she felt that she was in love with Leonard, but then she struggled with the whole physical side of it, the whole sexual side of it, and the letters that she writes to him are astoundingly honest. She tells him how she feels, writing to him a few weeks before she finally accepted his proposal, before they finally got engaged. She explained to him what was holding her back. And when you think about this being 100 years ago, I think it's amazingly honest for a young woman to write like this to a young man. She says, as I told you brutally the other day, I feel no attraction to you. There are moments, when you kissed me the other day was one, when I feel no more than a rock. I think if you're a man being told that a woman feels no more than a rock for you, it's pretty discouraging. But she hesitated, perhaps not because she felt too little, but because she hoped for so much from their relationship. She said, we both of us want a marriage that is a tremendous living thing, always alive, always hot, not dead and easy in parts, as most marriages are. We ask a great deal of life, don't we? Again, I think that's a very perceptive and honest way to write to the man that you're about to marry. She wants a marriage that's living, alive, not dead and easy. And then there's been much speculation, of course, much gossip about the sexual dimension of the Woolfs' relationship. Was the marriage ever consummated? Was Virginia frigid? Was she a lesbian? Did she have all these affairs? Or did she just not have sex with anybody? In 1967, so 50 years later, her half-brother, Gerald, wrote, he added fuel to the fire of all the speculation. He wrote, Leonard told me that when on their honeymoon he had tried to make love to her, she got into such a violent state of excitement that he had to stop, knowing as he did that these states were a prelude to her attacks of madness. So Leonard had to give up all idea of ever having any sort of sexual satisfaction. And there's a lot of this in Bloomsbury at the time. There's a lot of discussion about whether she denied Leonard, whether Leonard just had to live like a monk, all this stuff. There's lots of gossip. But then they gossiped about each other's sex lives and who was sleeping with who the whole time, constantly. So what's true and what's not? What did Virginia actually expect from their marriage? Well, before their engagement, again, she wrote to Leonard, I want everything, love, children, adventure, intimacy, work. And I think if you read her own words in this way, you see that she did want all that. She did want the physical side, she did want love, and she did want children. She's so often portrayed as stern and cold and unloving and very unmaternal, but this is really not accurate. My father remembers Virginia as my dad still is 89, and so he's one of the few people that still remember her. Obviously, people are dying off. But my dad remembers a wonderful aunt who loved being with her nieces and nephews and really, really was very loving and very warm. Again, Virginia adored looking after her sister, Vanessa Bell, the artist, Vanessa Bell. She adored looking after Vanessa's children, and she and Leonard did hope for a family of their own. She wrote poignantly in 1913, we aren't going to have a baby now, but we want to have one. So I think, they were trying. For me, one of the saddest insights in Virginia's diaries is the profound sense of loss for the family that they didn't have. She blamed herself for her childlessness, writing to a friend in 1926, a little more self-control on my part, and we might have had a boy of 12 by now, or a girl of 10. It was sort of decided for her, this thing about not having children. it was decided by her doctors and by her husband Leonard and by her sister Vanessa that she was too unstable for motherhood. Her sister, somewhat interferingly, wrote, "The risk she runs is that of another bad nervous breakdown, and I doubt if even a baby would be worth that." And so it's kind of unfair, because there's Vanessa having endless children and endless lovers, but of course they decided that Virginia shouldn't have any children, shouldn't be allowed to have children. Then again, given that not having children didn't prevent her having breakdowns, I sometimes wonder whether actually having children would have helped her. So during 1910, 1912, and 1913, Virginia was sent for rest cures, which is, nervous breakdown treatment, in a private nursing home for women with nervous disorder in Twickenham, which is near Richmond. Her doctors were extremely strict, and they insisted on total rest of the intellect. So there are large gaps in her letters and in her diaries during the mad times when she wasn't allowed to write. As well as in forced seclusion, not seeing too many people, she was placed on a regime of weight gain, 4 or 5 pints of milk daily. That's a lot of milk. As well as beef cutlets, liquid malt extract, and beef tea. It all sounds disgusting. And it's really interesting to trace how the life echoes the work. Her experiences in the nursing home echo very closely what she writes in Mrs. Dalloway, when the celebrated psychiatrist, William Bradshaw, orders his patient to have rest in bed, rest in solitude, silence and rest without books. So it's exactly what Virginia was made to do. Understandably, Virginia felt very infantilized and frustrated at being prevented from writing and prevented from making her own decisions. In 1912, she complained, "Leonard made me into a comatose individual." This accusation has a degree of truth. Leonard took her away from the centre of London, Bloomsbury in the centre of London. He took her away from that because the excitement and the social excitement was sort of too much for her with the nervous breakdowns. And he replaced that with the peace and quiet and the leafy suburbs of Richmond. Leonard made her spend the mornings in bed. He constantly monitored her eating and her moods. He was constantly writing lists of things. My dad remembers Leonard always writing lists. Even if he bought a few bread rolls, he would write it down in a book. 2 bread rolls, one shilling or whatever. He wrote everything down. So Leonard's insistence on constant rest and rich food continued throughout Virginia's life. Even just before her suicide in 1941, Virginia was writing angrily in a letter to her doctor about the cream, the cheese, the milk. So she was obviously still being forced to eat this rich food. But she did know that Leonard was right about the danger signals. As she wrote to a friend, Jacques Ravarat, in 1922, "Unless I weigh 9.5 stone, I hear voices and see visions and can neither write nor sleep." So she obviously started to learn the signs that she would stop sleeping, that she wouldn't be able to think straight when her weight dropped. And again, she knew that she owed Leonard her life. He stopped her from committing suicide. In 1929, she wrote to her alleged lover, Vita Sackville-West, "I would have shot myself long ago in one of these illnesses if it hadn't been for him." So what was Virginia really like as a person? Well, as I said, as time goes on, there are fewer and fewer people who knew her, who actually knew her. In fact, I can think of maybe 3 or 4 who are still living now. My father, who lived in Leonard's London home in Victoria Square for 30 years, remembers Virginia, his aunt, as volatile, mercurial, moody. He says, "She could be quite sharp. She looked sharp. Her face was sharp. When you arrived at their house, Virginia would ask you about your journey, and she wanted every detail. Okay, you came by train. Tell me about the people in the carriage." She would take the information that you gave her about your journey or whatever, and then she would recycle it. She would use it in an article, or she would recycle it into something of her books. You'd tell her something, a little story or an account, and by the next week, Virginia would have built it up into a big deal, exaggerating everything. So it was this wonderful writer-in process, taking the details and then sort of changing them and exaggerating them and blowing them up into something bigger. And it could actually be quite embarrassing. It would cause arguments for the person who told you the story originally. So as we've seen, 1915 was a really difficult time for the Woolfs with Virginia's mental breakdowns and hospitalizations. But it was also a really difficult time for Europe, we have to remember. Although Virginia didn't write directly about war, the conflict resonates through many of her novels, particularly Jacob's Room, if you know that one, Mrs. Dalloway, with constant echoes of the armies, the bombs and the guns overheard across the English Channel that you can hear from France. Similarly to the lighthouse and the years were inspired by Virginia's experiences of living through the First World War and then the forthcoming Second World War. In January 1915, strategic bombing by the Germans had begun, and they were launching Zeppelin raids over London, right over the centre of London. It's easy to forget, I think, 100 years on, how frightening it must have been to live in a country under attack when you're also, going through all sorts of personal stuff and having these breakdowns. They exacerbated all of that. Most of the Bloomsbury group, most of Virginia's friends and her social set, were passionately anti-war, including Maynard Keynes, the economist, Lytton Strachey, the writer, and Leonard Woolf himself, who said that the war was senseless and useless. Her brother-in-law, Clive Bell, wrote an anti-war pamphlet that was destroyed by the Lord Mayor of London, and Bertrand Russell, her friend, the philosopher, was imprisoned for pacifism. When conscription was introduced in 1916, Virginia wrote to a friend, "The whole of our world does nothing but talk about conscription and their chances of getting off." So they were all trying to get out of signing up for the war. In the end, Leonard Woolf did get off. He got off conscription due to his shaking hands, which is a Woolf tremor apparently, and also his wife's mental instability. So you had to go before a panel and basically make your case for why you couldn't sign up. For Virginia, her opposition to war was actually very closely linked to her feminism. She described war as a preposterous masculine fiction. And in The Three Guineas, she wrote, "The chief occupations of men are the shedding of blood, the making of money, the giving of orders, and the wearing of uniforms." So it still holds true today, you could say. The war features frequently in her wartime letters and diaries, and in fact they spent many nights sheltering in the cellar of their Richmond home. And they had to struggle with shortages and the rationing of milk and bread and all of those things, just like everyone else. So it wasn't as though they were immune to all the problems of war. Despite all that, and despite the mounting casualties and people in the family, cousins and brothers that died, and despite her breakdowns, there were some intensely happy times too at the beginning of 1915. On Virginia's 33rd birthday in January 1915, she writes, "Leonard crept into my bed with a little parcel, which was a beautiful green purse. I was then taken up to town," so she'd taken into London, "I was then taken up to town free of charge and given a treat, first at a picture palace and then at the tea rooms in Oxford Street. I don't know when I have enjoyed a birthday so much," which I think it's really touching, this idea that Leonard took her out for a treat. She was turning 33, she sounds like a child. Some of her diary entries of 1915 to 16 are positively carefree, despite this looming breakdown. She describes a shopping trip after her skirt has split in two. Leonard goes to the lending library, and Virginia goes to ramble about the West End, picking up clothes. "I am really in rags. It is very amusing. I bought a 10 and 11 penny blue dress." She then goes on and to talk about how London inspires her writing. She says, "I had tea and rambled down to Charing Cross in the dark." And this is London during the Blitz. "I had tea and rambled down to Charing Cross in the dark, making up phrases and incidents to write about, which is, I expect, the way one gets killed." It's a lovely idea of her wandering about London in the dark. A few days later, Leonard and Virginia went to see a printing press in Farringdon. And you've probably heard of the Hogarth Press, which is what they eventually bought this press and then started publishing their own work. In 1917, they began publishing T.S. Eliot. They were the first people to publish The Wasteland. They published Catherine Mansfield, E.M. Forster, and Sigmund Freud, among other notable 20th century writers. However, in February 1915, Virginia's health deteriorated very suddenly. Within days, she entered a state of garrulous mania, speaking ever more wildly, incoherently, and incessantly. Soon she lapsed into gibberish and sank into a coma. By March, she was being cared for by professional nurses, and she was unable to see or even speak to Leonard. He wrote at that time that she was violently hostile, and for some reason, I don't know why, she seems to have been particularly hostile towards Leonard. At times, her psychotic episodes were so severe that they required 4 nurses to actually physically hold her, and there was genuine doubt over whether she would actually recover. She remained under professional care, as I mentioned, for the next 6 months when she finally returned to their house in Richmond, Hogarth House. She says, "I spend my spare time in bed, but I'm allowed out in the afternoons, and thank God the last nurse is gone." So she really hated this. She really hated being cared for and just wanted to be well again. So there's lots of gossip and speculation about Leonard and Virginia's marriage. But whatever the truth, and obviously no one can know the truth, knowing about other people from the outside is impossible, but it was certainly a partnership of great importance to the 20th century. Leonard Woolf, too, is a wonderful writer, and without him, I don't think, without Leonard, it's unlikely that Virginia would have actually stayed alive to write some of her greater later works in the 1920s and 30s. To the Lighthouse, for example, which was written in 1927, The Years, which is 1937, and then Between the Acts, which was her last book in 1941. These are all now considered groundbreaking modernist texts. And also, there is no doubting the profound love between the two of them. Virginia's suicide note to Leonard, written just before she drowned herself in the River Ouse in Sussex in March 1941, is certainly testament to that extraordinary closeness between them. She writes, "What I want to say is I owe all the happiness of my life to you. You have been entirely patient with me and incredibly good. I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been." You know, it's a love letter as well as a suicide note. So when The Voyage Out, her first book, was published 100 years ago, it was well received by the critics, but actually by that time, Virginia was too ill to know. A few days later, when Leonard formally registered her, you used to have to register as a writer, he formally registered her as an author, and she didn't know about that either. In January 1915, after a walk along the River Thames with her dog getting into a fight and her stockings falling down, she noted in her diary, "My writing now delights me, solely because I love writing and don't honestly care a hang what anyone says." She says, "What seas of horror one dives through in order to pick up these pearls. However, they are worth it." In the end, I say that the madness is part of the writing and the writing is part of the madness. I adore her writing and I adore a lot about my great aunt, but I don't always like her. She's very rude about other people in my family. For example, she called my father at the age of 14 the boy with the sloping nose, which is a bit of an odd way of describing her nephew. The more I read of Virginia Woolf, the more I see that it's impossible to put her into a neat box or reduce her to a simple caricature. She was complex and contradictory. She was difficult but a rewarding writer, bitchy and snobbish at times, but also funny, charming, and apparently great fun at parties. So whatever you think of Virginia and whatever you've read of her, I hope today has made you a little less afraid of Virginia Woolf. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know if anyone has any questions or anything they want to say. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah?
I would just love to hear a little bit about your own personal journey in terms of discovering your great aunt, the human being, the woman, versus the noted writer with all of, the mental illness, the ups and downs. How has it been for you discovering sort of different parts of her difficult past and reconciling that with your current research and your analysis in retrospect?
Well, you're right to kind of break it down like that because there are different parts to it. When I was little, obviously people at school and stuff, you know that you're part of the Woolf family, and Woolf is a kind of name, a literary name in London. And always these hordes of Americans would come to my parents' London home, and we've got the kitchen table that Virginia and Leonard ate at and worked at. So we've got the kitchen table that we have breakfast at, and these people would come and look at things and want to talk to my dad about her. And so as a small child, I never really understood why. And then at university, I studied English at Oxford, and it was really exciting to start reading her properly for the first time. But I remember calling my mum in a blind panic before my first essay was due, saying, "I don't get it, I don't get to the Lighthouse at all." And it's not an easy read. None of her books are easy reads. You kind of have to get into the the way with Virginia Woolf. You have to get the stream of consciousness, the fact that she writes about what's going on in the mind, and that it's not day by day. It's the fact that an hour can go by and you experience so much inside, and then another day, an hour can go by and nothing's happening. So getting a handle on her and on her work sort of opened it all up for me. And since then, it's a privilege. I mean, I love writing about her. I love reading her letters and diaries, I guess, as well as her novels. Although I realized, actually, I have never read Orlando, which is really embarrassing and shameful. And has anyone read Orlando, and do you recommend it? Do you recommend it? Okay. It's quite exciting to have one that I haven't read. So there we go. Thank you for the question. Is there anyone else? No? Yes?
Maybe it's just a mother-in-law thing, or was it that bad? She just, wanted her own space with Leonard and his family, and that was too much like a baggage or weight. That's what comes across. Was it that bad for her, or was it? What was her relationship with the mother-in-law, or just the mother-in-law, the Jewish thing, and it was.
Actually, yeah, she was quite rude about her mother-in-law, who's Leonard's mother, but in a sort of funny way. I mean, she was, as I said, she's satirical and snobby about people, quite bitchy, really bitchy about Catherine Mansfield, another writer. But writers are like that. I think we're all like that. We feel jealous about the people in our fields. Why are they getting coverage? Why are they getting reviews? Anything that you do, I think you feel. The thing about Virginia is, the reason that people call her anti-Semitic or snobbish or whatever is because she's honest. I think if most of our thoughts were transmitted out there, we might be, So she wasn't malicious about it. She didn't. When she accepted Leonard to marry him, she wrote about him as a penniless Jew, but she loved him. So it's a kind of jokey. I know that we wouldn't use that kind of language now, but again, it's 100 years ago. So it was often very affectionate. Yes. Yeah. And they were a big, sprawling, mad family anyway, so that's true. Yeah, question? Yep. You? Red t-shirt.
I just wanted to check or ask you, which do you think is Virginia Woolf's most underrated work?
That's easy. I think The Waves, which she wrote in 1939. I love it, absolutely love it, and people think it's unreadable. 1931. It was her big modernist experiment, and it's not really widely read, but I think honestly The Waves is beautiful, and don't read it as a book, just dip into it. She called it a prose poem, and it's just divided, it's 6 characters divided into 6 parts, and it goes from sunrise to sunset, and from the beginning of their lives to the end of their lives. And it's just beautiful, and honestly, you can just read just a few pages, a few paragraphs. It's such a lovely, poetic work, and I think I'd really recommend The Waves.
Thank you.
Okay. Aha, now the questions are coming thick and fast. Come on, I want one from everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't think it's just your aunt. I mean, there are hundreds of writers, who have either committed suicide or they've been into mental asylums. There are so many in India. So why is it, that, this is something that has been bothering me. I mean, is it that writers are very complex, or what is it?
But is it just writers? Because what about musicians? Lots of them died at 27. There's a whole 27 club. What about artists? Musicians are pretty tortured. I think there is something about the creative process that can drive you to the brink. And I also think there's something about the frustration, but also the need to express yourself, that can cause you to come up against, existential angst and all of that. That's probably a bit simplistic, but you know what I mean. I don't know whether it's just writers. She was troubled throughout her life, but maybe what I'm trying to say is maybe being troubled and feeling the depth of those feelings means that you're more likely to. You don't just go along doing an office job 9 to 5. You're quite. She didn't have much. She didn't have a thick skin, she's pretty sensitive, and I think that makes you probably more creative and more sensitive to the world around you. And I think that's probably true for lots of creative types.
So you need to be tormented to be to be in the creative process,
Well,
or is it the other way around?
I don't think it's either. I don't think you have to be. There are lots of writers I know who are perfectly happy, and but I think the torment is part of the process. I also think that, as I keep saying, it's 100 years ago, 75 years since she committed suicide. Nowadays, if she had bipolar, that would have been treated. I also think she had anorexia. That would have been treated. You wouldn't call it a nervous disorder. You wouldn't call it hysteria. Women, hysteria. Whatever. If you had PMT or if you had postnatal depression, all these things now we would have helped and we would have treated. So you have to remember the context as well, I think.
Also the social context, I think, because
yeah.
100 years back...
and 2 world wars that she went through, the pressure of all that on top of everything else, and the very practical pressures of not having enough food, not having... when Hitler was about to invade, and we thought it was going to invade Britain, Leonard and Virginia Woolf had suicide plans drawn up. They and their Jewish friends and family and Jewish people in England had plans drawn up for how they would kill themselves if Hitler invaded. That's not a joke. Living under that kind of pressure, if you're at all sensitive, I think would drive many of us to feel extremely unbalanced. So you're right, it's the context as well.
So do you think she influenced you in any way?
Gosh, is that why I write non-fiction? My fiction is nowhere near... No, of course it's terrible. It's terrible. She's inspired me. She's inspired me, but no, I'm sure she would be turning in her graves if she read any of my stuff.